Welcome to the GovComms podcast, bringing you the latest insights and innovations from experts and thought leaders around the globe in government communication. Now, here is your host, David Pembroke.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to GovComms, the podcast that examines the practice of content communication in government and the public sector. My name is David Pembroke, and thank you very much for joining me once again. Today, I have a guest by the name of Sheena Ireland, and she's the director at Specialists in Communications, and they're doing some quite interesting things in government communications here in Canberra, and we'll come to that in a moment. But Sheena has a long and extensive career in senior communications in positions in government and in industry. She's worked in the areas of science and research, automotive, arts, and in sport. Through that 16-year career, she's worked with government and industry bodies. She's worked as the Director of Stakeholder Relations at the Australian Research Council. She was a media advisor to a federal government cabinet minister and communications manager for the Federal Chamber of Automotive Industry. She's got a great background, a great career, and she joins me in the studio. Sheena, thanks very much for joining us on GovComms.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me.
So, maybe the backstory of Sheena Ireland. Where are you from, and how did you find your way into this interesting world of government and public sector communication?
Well, interestingly enough, I kind of fell into government when I wasn't actually sure what I wanted to do with my life. So I joined the public service at 18, not quite knowing which uni degree to necessarily do. So it turns out it was a wonderful move. I went in on a 2-month holiday cover. 12 years later, I decided to step out and go to a peak body and then start my own business after that. So I feel like I grew up in government, which is why I have such a passion for government. My first roles were in kind of the facilities area, but then I slowly went across to areas and did communications, and then sort of went to do task force orientated stuff, and so communications became such a theme that I then did my degree while working, and eventually went on to be a Director of Stakeholder Relations at the Australian Research Council, which is a great sort of agency in the government. Went on to work for a minister, and then kind of doing everything I thought I could in that government career, stepped out to go into a lobby group, which is not far from government, and learn a whole range of new skills.
So across that's really the almost the full gamut of government, public sector, up onto the hill. What's your view of the current state of government communications? As technology changes, as it empowers people, is it becoming more important, and how ready are we to take advantage of these changes in technology?
I think it's extremely important. I think what we've got is a bit of a crowded marketplace at the moment for communications in every area. Back when I started, things were simpler. We could go to an RSL, meet with a bunch of farmers and talk to them about the issues that affected them, telecommunications, anything. We could work with post offices in regional areas to put out campaign material that actually reached the audience we wanted to. When I started in comms, not every agency really had a website that they put information on. And so with the rise of, I guess, that digital communications, things sort of became easier, but in a way people then had this perception that they could just put it on a website, or they could put something on Facebook and it would go out to the public. So we lost that ability, I think, to do strategy, coupled with the fact that there's so much pressure to get things done short term. And there is such a focus on the 24/7 media. And yes, there has to be a focus. I think we're in a dynamic at the moment where we're not given enough time necessarily to do that strategy and to really target that audience. And I think there's some amazing communicators in government. There's some amazing work going on, and some of the cut through is the bit where it's time for government to build those relationships and work on how some of those messages can cut through to the right audience, which is not always media.
That's often the complaint that you hear from government communicators all the time, is that there's not enough time. They can't get it done because they're too busy doing the doing. They can't get to the strategy work, and therefore the capability around strategy starts to fall off because they're not often doing it. They're just creating stuff, so to speak. How is that difficult problem solved?
So I have a lot of conversations about this. Sometimes it's actually going back to the basics. It's getting comms involved from the beginning. It's having really diverse teams at the beginning of a project. We talk a lot about in this day and age, digital service delivery, and the issues that often communicators find when they're getting up to speed on a project halfway through or at the end, having to communicate a new program when they're only getting information at the end. And so those diverse teams at the beginning, having comms as a seat at the table at the beginning of that transformation process and all the way throughout can help them not only help navigate the process and get it to the right audience and pick up little things that others mightn't, it actually can help them communicate to the best of their abilities at the end. There's a reason in those projects we need people, across policy, across comms, across IT. Those diverse teams at the beginning, I think, are essential. They're starting to happen in some areas, but they're not happening across the board. And I think time and money, is one thing.
Do you think agile, which is now, every time you wander into a new government department, there's, stand-ups and Kanbans and all these other things that are going on. Do you think that's helping or is that hindering? Sort of speed and pace and, let's change and try and move and adapt.
Yeah. I mean, I'm all for some of those stand-up meetings and getting people across things, but it again comes back to strategy. It's, the right time and the place. Is it relevant to have it every morning? Maybe. Is it relevant to include everyone? Maybe not. Who are the right people to include? When are the right milestones? And if we're overdoing it with the agiles, the stand-up meetings, let's be honest, human behaviour is that we kind of disengage because we feel like we know it all. We've been to these meetings, it's wasting our time. So that relevance of every one of those meetings needs to be considered.
Yeah. Here, I can hear people say, one more stand-up that I've got to do is going to kill me. But interestingly, I think going back to that point that you raise about diverse teams at the beginning of projects, how does comms get involved? How do they find themselves to be invited if often they're not invited because they're not thought about to be worthy to be involved in a conversation, because ultimately, they are the colouring in department at the end of the line, and they will just produce and make it look pretty, make it look good.
Absolutely.
They're not valued as, say, behavioural scientists or economics people may be.
Yeah, and I think that's the huge point. They are the colouring people at the end of the chain. And so I think as communicators, across government, everyone needs to kind of look at how they're selling themselves internally, how they're asserting their worth. I run some planning days with comms units, and I did one recently where the reality was the team were just too helpful. They ended up doing briefing notes for everyone in the agency. Now, is that a good use of their time? Not really. Does that show their skills? Not really. And when we put it to them, of course, they wanted to be helpful. They wanted to help everyone, but in reality, they're de-skilling the agency from doing those briefing notes. So having those hard conversations and going, okay, what is the value of comms? Is it just doing briefing notes? Is it just doing the colouring in? Probably not. So it's up to communications people, I think, to really assert their worth. And it's not just individually within agencies. I think across the whole APS and in all of the state governments, I think it's everyone working together to actually show that comms should have a seat at the table, because when they do, the outcomes actually are far greater than we can imagine.
So indeed, that's I suppose gets to the point of having a process perhaps that they can bring to those conversations early, but then to demonstrate that worth, demonstrate that value. But again, how do you do that? How do you demonstrate value?
Yeah, sometimes I say it's pushback. So sometimes I know when I was working within government, it's being able to push back on all levels and even push back towards ministers' offices. I mean, we've gotten to a stage where there's just a yes, I'll deliver, and hence the comms team become known as the people who do briefing notes or certain other things that aren't necessarily a good showcase of their skills. And that power of the frank and fearless advice, because that the strategy element of a communicator, a great communicator who can look across everything and give a great strategic view as well as do the implementation, is worth their weight in gold. But we're not showcasing that strategy element. We're not necessarily pushing back on people to say, actually, I think we should do it a different way, and this is why. It's doing the thorough explain through too, instead of just pushing back once and saying no. It's pushing back and saying, actually, because of this, or have you thought of this way in doing things? And actually, if we really want to reach our audience, this is what we do. So it's being, brave and bold to have those conversations.
And not always being a pleaser.
Yes. Yeah, and we fall into that. I think as communicators, we want to please, we want to serve. So it's very easy to fall into those behavioural patterns of wanting to please.
Yeah.
And what we do is then we take it away from actually that real great value of, some of that pushback stuff is worth its weight in gold and can make or break something.
So are you seeing signs of it? Are you seeing signs of improvement of comms areas really standing up and saying, look, this is what we do. Here's the service that we can, here's the value that we can deliver, where they've got really good defined service offerings that can explain quite clearly to people where it is that the value can be created?
Yes, I have seen it, and I think what it takes is bold leadership. And, I've spoken to a lot of even young communicators lately who want to, who have that great strategic view and by all intents and purposes have come into the government because they want to make a difference. And sometimes then they're under leadership that is, not necessarily the type that will push back. Or we have comms units that are led by people who aren't from a comms background because, I always talk about when I started in comms, it was recognised as a professional specialist skill, just like your legal area, whereas now comms is kind of, anyone who can write can go into a comms unit, or actually anyone can lead a comms unit. And I would argue that that's not necessarily the case. Comms is still a specialist skill. And by just allowing anyone to lead a comms unit, they can do their best. And I feel sorry for people who get put in this situation because, it's hard when you don't understand the elements of communication strategy or anything like that. It can be hard to try and lead a comms unit. So you need someone who actually has those skills to be in leadership, and then you need that bold leadership who's going to actually, assert their worth and assert themselves to be a seat at the table.
I heard an interesting thing said the other day by a senior member of the Australian Public Service, and they were discussing the types of people who sit at the top of the tree, the types of people who are secretaries of departments and deputy secretaries of the department, and they're generally not from a comms background. They don't have that type of personality, so they don't tend to value it as much, or they don't tend to understand where that value can come from. And I thought that was quite interesting, understanding that organisationally they're not seeing the value because they don't understand that there is value to be achieved there.
Yeah, it's extremely true. And I noticed it in the car industry, to be honest. And I love the car industry, worked in there for a long time. But in a similar way, what happened was, when Australia had domestic manufacturing, a lot of the car companies were headed by, people of an economic background, people of a finance background. And this is what happens in the government. You've got secretaries who are in, have an economic background, a finance background.
Policy.
Yeah, and that's great, and that has great worth. But if they're surrounded by a team that is like them, then that's where the conversations are going to go. If they're surrounded by a diverse team that includes comms, that includes marketing, that includes sales, anything like that, the conversations can change and the outcomes can change. And the reason I raised the car industry is it was interesting when it was a manufacturing base, the heads of the companies were from those finance backgrounds, and quite interestingly, when things changed and we transitioned to the automotive industry, the heads largely then became the people who had come through sales and marketing and communications, and the way those companies ran had to change, and it did change because, again, when you're not manufacturing in a country, your focus has to be sales, but that increase of the communications is amazing as well. So, I think departments are a bit the same. It's who's been put at the top, and it doesn't necessarily mean we need comms people at the very top, but what we need is that person who's at the top surrounded by comms people who can provide that frank and fearless advice and that lens.
Yeah. So interestingly, you're just demonstrating your own leadership in this space by putting together a grouping called our Comms Network. Now, tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so our Comms Network is something I think I've had in my head for about 10 years now, and it's finally just been the right time, I guess, to put it out there. But largely it's to get together communicators from across government and from across that ecosystem too. Yeah. So, the consultants that work closely with government, as well as the communicators or the CEOs in peak bodies and government communicators. Now, there's, the main thing is to get people networking and to get those relationships going because, again, with that time issue that we're having, what I'm seeing or what I'm hearing is a lot of comms people aren't networking across departments. And so gone are the days where you just picked up the phone, and I used to do this in the Australian Research Council, picked up the phone to another department and said, hey, we've got this thing going on. It touches on your issues. Can we just have a chat about where that falls?
Yeah.
And
it's interesting. Sorry to interrupt you,
Yeah.
but it's interesting you say that, because I did have a conversation with a very senior government communication specialist from overseas who came to Australia, came to Canberra in particular, and was amazed at the lack of cross engagement, that the lack of people talking to each other. He said nobody knows anyone. Nobody knows where anyone is, because everyone's so busy they don't have time to go and do it. But then there's no real structures. And I know, the IABC have attempted, the PRIA have attempted over time. But because there's no priority put on it from the centre as to be, a function, a capability, a profession, such as in the UK, therefore it's quite splintered and fractured here in Australia.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. And what we're trying to do is, and it's literally starts as a word of mouth, and so we're trying of word of mouth to sort of put it out there and get people in, and it is about forming those connections and showing people that that's worthwhile, showing people the importance of having those connections and how it can not just help them in terms of their personal and development, but their professional development, their agency's development or their department's development, because suddenly they've got those networks or those connections across departments that make things easier. It's also sharing knowledge. Often in government, if we've got newer comms teams, they're not sure what boundaries, or if you've got, a senior leader who is very strict on boundaries, it can be perceived that in communications you can't be creative, or you can't necessarily do this, or you can't spend money in a certain way. So learning from people's experience can start to break down some of those perceptions and go, okay, well, this is how we got around this issue. This is how we, found out about our audience. This is how we did our market research, or this is even how we asserted that we needed a seat at the table in strategy, because I think comms is quite an isolating role in the sense that it doesn't have the peaks and troughs that other people talk about in different areas. Not that I think government's got peaks and troughs anymore. Everyone's busy as anything. But, people don't look after their health, their well-being, anything like that, because you're attached to a mobile phone that you can get a call from the minister's office or media or secretaries or anyone at any hour. And I know that's not everyone, but that's a reality that says people have to be constantly switched on. You ask any comms person and they're reading their emails before bed and first thing when they get up. So they've gotten into an environment that's so busy that we want to kind of break that cycle and help them network and learn from others and learn the importance of separating themselves sometimes from their phone and their emails, so they can be more creative and they can actually go back to that comms stuff that they love, as opposed to feeling it's a burden in a way because they're so busy.
Yeah. And how are you going to make that happen? How are you going to help people to find the time to be able to engage in this community?
So it's a problem we're still working on. So at the moment what we're doing is having panel discussion events. So we feel like getting people involved in the discussions by way of panel events will help them see some benefit in coming to every event. So we're getting senior leaders from government, ex-political journalists, people like that, to come and actually have a good conversation. So by getting those, I guess, good speakers on the panel, we're hoping to actually then get the attendance. And we started to get some attendance. The first event, as is with any comms event, you get sort of 10 people who message you at the last minute because they can't get out of the office, which is fine. And then the other 20, are able to come. And so we kind of expect that at every event. We've got a LinkedIn group that we're encouraging people to do discussions in. So if they can't attend because they are so busy, they can at least start to see what kind of discussions might unfold through that LinkedIn event. We're also having discussions with them. I've had one-on-ones with quite a few people to link them with mentors. So if they can't attend events, they could at least start to look at a mentoring arrangement or a mentee arrangement, and that's cross-department. I always believe it should never be in the same department. It should be cross-department. So we're trying a sort of a multifaceted approach to get people in and involved. And then if they see the value in those points, they'll hopefully go to the events. And the events are really just to help provide knowledge and to help with information sharing and, to help all of us kind of look at how we can better show the great work that's going on in the government, because, you know, you hear the frustrations, I hear the frustrations, I think we all hear the frustrations, because there's some amazing people doing some amazing work that never seems to get out there, and people are constantly chasing their tails. So that's kind of where we're trying to get it out, and that's the sell. And so for me, I guess the good part is, you know, I'm just starting it to bring together people. So the numbers don't matter at each event. You know, we could have 20 at one event and we're still going to run it. We can have 60 at another event and we're still going to run it. So the good part about that is we can start to just work with what we've got and start to foster that connections, and then hopefully that word of mouth will help get it out.
Okay, well, that's very noble. It's a fantastic, and it's really just a commitment, really, to try to build the profession, isn't it?
Absolutely, it is. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, great. So, how can people get involved?
So there is a LinkedIn group. They can search Our Comms Network and you know, hit the button to go into that group, and I can accept them. They can email me at sheena@sicomms.com. So it's sicoms.com.au.
Yep.
You know, or look me up on LinkedIn.
Yep.
And, you know, I'll send them all the details. We have just an email list that I send out to people. I do a lot of one-on-one follow-ups and calls and things like that, and I'm always happy to meet with people for coffee just to talk about the group, and, as I said, linking people with mentors or mentees.
Yep.
You know.
Any aspiration to take it further than Canberra, or just to sort of do it here, get it right, and then see what happens? Not just in Australia, but on this podcast we have people in government communications listening from all over the world. So perhaps they can get involved as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to hear from you know, anyone across the world or anyone across Australia. We're working with some people in the New South Wales government at the moment to look at running, particularly one on digital service delivery, an event, a panel discussion event in Sydney, and looking to start up a communicators network up there as well. You know, obviously anyone can attend that as well. So there's a few people I've talked to in the federal government who want to go up to that event as well. So everyone can, you know, we're all transient. Yep. So we are looking at doing something in New South Wales in the next coming months, so stay tuned. It'll be one big sort of network in itself, and just with events run in different locations.
Yep.
And our plan is to have some side focus groups if we feel the need to look at certain issues. You know, the APS review's going on at the moment. It could be that we look to have a focus group that actually says, okay, well, let's stop and think, because I haven't heard of anyone in comms actually putting anything forward to that review, again, because of the busyness or, you know, the want to serve others, and instead of looking at their own. And so looking at, okay, is there a chance to say, okay, we'll set up a focus group and we'll look at, okay, what are the big things that need to change in comms, or how do we better assert ourselves, and how do we put that forward? Because, you know, APS reform is going to go on for a couple of years now. How do we make sure that we don't miss this opportunity to put ourselves forward for this as well?
Interesting. I did hear actually from somebody else that it has been a theme.
Yeah.
Even though the communications but didn't have time to put things in, just through the consultation of the group that is actually doing it, there is some consideration being given for where is the function, where does it sit, where does it live, how does it work, how do we develop it, how do we take it forward. So I think there might be some interesting things come out of that APS review.
Yeah, exactly.
So we'll wait and see.
Exciting
now,
times.
listen, just before we've got a few more minutes before we finish today, and what I always like to do is to try to use our guests and to squeeze them while we've got them to get as much value from them as possible. So how then, just perhaps some advice. What advice do you have for government communicators at the moment in terms of the skills that they need to acquire and the skills that they need to have to be more relevant, to be more valuable to their organisations?
Yeah. I would say never neglect skills development. But in terms of skills, I know a lot of people have a focus on those digital skills, and there's a lot of people coming through with that. I would say going back to those soft skills and those human skills, the value of a great communicator is that, you know, we acknowledge and we look at human behaviour. We identify our audiences. And so going back to those human behaviours, looking at empathy, applying empathy to every area. I mean, you know, working with comms units, working with parliamentary units, As soon as you assert empathy into those processes and people understand where everything's at, suddenly the process can work so much better. And that is the power that communicators have. I mean, our studies are all on human behaviour and how people connect. Without a connection, we've got no communication. So I would say to every communicator, yes, there's a push to learn every digital platform, to move forward and things like that. I think there's enough people coming through. I think communicators need to go back to basics and look at that strategy, look at empathy, look at the human elements, look at behaviour. That's the training that we often neglect to keep up with, and that's the training we often forget as soon as we walk out of that university door.
Yeah, right. So being able to bring that, and how do you bring empathy into discussions? What is the best way?
So for me, I think empathy is, it's that walking in someone else's shoes, or it's sitting in a place where you can sort of sit with that person, and that obviously can be anyone, but looking at your audience and going, okay, if I was sitting with them, what are they feeling, what are they doing, why are they acting that way, why are people asking such questions, what are their real pain points, all of those kind of things. It's being able to be in someone else's shoes fully.
Yeah. But to sustain that in a conversation and to create value from that, how do you do that time and time again in a busy environment where perhaps, as you say, there's not often a lot of time to be able to be stopping and thinking because we're so busy doing the doing?
Yeah. And so I think it is still stop and think, but it's just question everything. And that doesn't have to take long. If you're writing something, question it. Does it reach the audience? How are they going to perceive it? And remember that, and I think the biggest thing with empathy we lack is we forget that not everyone is on our level. So we try to communicate to everyone on our level. We assume everyone has the same amount of knowledge we have. And so empathy is about going, hold on, what level of knowledge does this person have? Have I actually, done, does this communication actually help them, or does it kind of go over their head, or is it defensive conversation, which is never going to get anywhere? I think it's always questioning everything, going, if I received this, how would I feel?
Yeah. Okay. So you're optimistic about the future of government communications? You think that the march is on, the march up the value chain is on, and that comms will be able to assert itself over time?
Very much so. So I'm really optimistic. There's some great skills. There's some great talent. I mean, and it's the reality is we need it.
Though, isn't
we
it?
need it.
Ultimately, that's what it gets back to, is that it's so critical.
Yeah.
Because if you can't explain policy, if people don't understand what you're doing and why the reasons why you're doing it, well, ultimately it's going to fail.
Absolutely.
And so therefore the comms people have to be part of the solution.
Absolutely.
So you've got your writing instructions out there, people. Time to go out there and get involved in those conversations as early as possible, and make sure that when you go into these conversations, you've got structure, you've got that questioning that Sheena talks about, but you can demonstrate the value of not only your ideas, but then that effective implementation and evaluation. That's probably one thing.
Yeah.
One more thing that we haven't touched on yet is really the lack of evaluation.
Absolutely.
That where there is no evaluation, there can be no value. So people will not give you the credit for something unless you're being able to go back and say, look, these are the impacts that we were able to have.
Absolutely. Evaluation is key. And, acknowledging when sometimes we have to pivot because we've done an evaluation and we've realised that we haven't actually got it right the first time.
Yeah. Very good. Okay, Sheena, thanks very much for coming in today and for sharing some of your valuable time with our audience, who I know certainly will appreciate that insights, and all the very best for our comms network. And if there's anything we can do over the next little while, I think, interestingly, some of those conversations might be really good to record and to be able to turn into content.
Yeah.
And so people could hear. So we might have a chat about that as well. Anyway, thanks to Sheena Ireland for coming in to the studio today here in Canberra, Australia. And thanks to you, the audience, for coming back once again. And I'll be back at the same time in 2 weeks, because we've now dropped it back to a 2-week schedule for our podcasts. So I'll be back in a couple of weeks, and I look forward to speaking to you again then. But for the moment, it's bye for now.
You've been listening to the GovComms podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate and subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes.